Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar this morning. It's a great pleasure today to host a webinar with Econocom, who have been members of the Chamber for a few years now and always very involved and supportive. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Frances Weston, who recently joined just a few months ago as the new Managing Director. They're going to tell us all about, or rather, she is going to tell us all about 5G and how to get ready. As usual, we'll start with the presentation, and at the end we'll take questions. So if you want to send your questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and I'll come back to do the Q&A with Frances after our presentation. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to you, Frances.
Great. So I'm going to just give it a moment to share my screen. I hope that you can see that in just now. Great. So welcome, everybody. And today I'm going to talk to you about one of the hot topics, but also one of my favorite topics in terms of technology, which is 5G. So I have started Econocom from March on the 13th exactly. And one of the things that I wanted to start doing is really share a little bit of thought leadership, but also a little bit of history around fifth generation technology and mobility, and give you a bit of color for the future. But first, let's start with a little bit of history. To summarize what we're going to be discussing today is what's so different about 5G. That's where the history comes in. A bit of controversy, so perhaps what's being discussed in the mass media, and what to expect then from 5G. Examples of 5G in action, and then differences of what's happening in the UK and in France despite coronavirus, and how 5G seems to be propelling in both countries, as well as just the barriers of adoption to 5G from an enterprise level, so from a corporate level, and how to get ready. So a couple of top tips that I hope will be useful if you're looking at implementing 5G within your organization. So what is so different about 5G? Well, first and foremost, 5G was started, the first generation of mobile phone was launched in 1983 by two gentlemen called John Foley and Bob Barnett. Perhaps not the gentleman that you see in the photo, but maybe look the same. They started by just issuing a first phone call. So believe it or not, 1983, there was the first telephone being used that was wireless, and that wireless communication company is now known as Verizon in the US. They created this and thought at the time that what they were doing was relatively unreasonable, but let's see what happened with it. And now you see that those thoughts that were considered also by the mass population as unreasonable are now very much reasonable and today's reality. Now, one of the beauties about first generation technology was really, well, first generation to second generation technology was really the ability to democratize the usage of wireless communication. Now, I don't know about you, but I definitely own one of these. And although it was at the time completely unbreakable, so you could throw it downstairs, you could play games with it, you would find that the Nokia, what we would call a brick, was something that enabled you to really just have a conversation, but also to be able to receive and send text messages, SMS. And that was really the definition of 2G. So from 1G, which was literally just taking in phone calls and making phone calls, receiving and making phone calls, 2G brings on SMS. What happens with this is that democratization really happens quite drastically. So 1G, where you would only get businessmen and perhaps the most elite that could afford the service, suddenly a Nokia phone is in everybody's hands, and you're able to, find a cost-effective way to deliver wireless solutions. So really, that's a massive shift change in our ability to communicate with one another, but also technology had to move fairly quickly in order to catch up with the times. Nokia at the time was the market leader. 1G, you would probably find that Motorola played a larger role in telecommunication and held that space for a long time. Now comes, 3G. Well, 3G really is where you start seeing what we call the Internet of Things, but it gives you a handset that's enabled not only to make and receive calls, to send and receive text messages, but also imagery, as well as internet. And the difference mainly between 3 and 4G is just all about speed. So what you would find is you would, and I remember this quite distinctively, you know, traveling and trying to access the internet, whether it was a map or whether it was just trying to find address details on the internet, it would take a fairly long time depending on where your personal location was in relation to a mast. And it would also depend on what country you were in and what kind of infrastructure was built around you. So here's where speed and connectivity changes quite drastically. In those days, trying to download perhaps a movie or a TV show on your phone was completely unheard of. The speeds could not take that amount of data into account to deliver a service and rich, high quality video and imaging. So that really is something that then 4G capitalizes on. Now, I'm not sure if you know, but I certainly know that companies such as Netflix and Amazon Prime, their business model started predominantly on sending and receiving DVDs in the post. And that changed quite drastically when 4G came into play, because suddenly you can stream episodes of your favorite shows, as well as look at and watch your favorite movies on the go. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't take a lot of time to download these, but it still enables you and I to actually go in and be able to consume this type of entertainment wherever we wanted to go. That said, it also started to bubble up where we saw the Internet of Things starting to become a bit more habitual in our day-to-day in terms of the devices that we bought, as well as looking at the entire spectrum of possibilities that didn't require a person to actually hand type in to a keyboard and consume data as well as use data. So 4G started that, but 5G is where it becomes really, really much different. So 5G takes us into the Internet of Things. And I don't know if you've ever watched Dragon's Den. I mean, I used to watch it fairly often. Now, I'm not sure if you remember this episode, but it's an episode around a gentleman who's selling a fruit blender. And the fruit blender is connected to the internet. And at the time, I think to myself, why would somebody buy a blender that's connected to the internet? Why would you need that kind of tech? And then comes, you know, a day-to-day home shopping escapade that I need to do as moving into a new home. And I suddenly look at all of these appliances that are internet enabled. And I think to myself again, why would I need to have a tumble dryer that is connected to the internet? Well, that in itself is the Internet of Things. So when we look at this concept, you know, 2020 is going to be the maker of the Internet of Things. We use the Internet of Things in so many different ways, whether it's in our cars with smart sensors and scanners, whether it's when you're going into a shopping, any kind of shopping experience in a supermarket or otherwise. And it really enables us to scrap a keyboard, but have items around us with smart sensors and scanners, take that data and create solutions. So the Internet of Things is really coupled with 5G, an extremely powerful tool for us to really advance, but also to be able to make really intelligent decisions going forward. So that is really the timeline between what was 1G, so phone calls plus text in 2. 3G was the internet starting to be enabled on smartphones. 4G, looking at smartphones but going faster, larger screens and stronger. And 2020 combines all of this with the Internet of Things. So the next slide is a little bit controversial because it depends on where you look and what statistics you're driving your thoughts on. So they say that at this stage that 4G versus 5G is 100 times faster. but it really depends. And that has a couple of different connotations that I want you to be aware of. The first thing we need to be mindful of is if you are located right near a 5G mast, you will have 5G enabled, and you have a 5G enabled telephone, you will be able to get those faster speeds. However, 5G comes in 3 flavors, as is being tested in the US. It comes in low, medium, and high bandwidth. So the low bandwidth is actually more akin to 4G. So it's really dependent on where you are and if you have the right type of infrastructure around you to be able to get these faster speeds. But essentially, it means that you can download in no time at all. And it allows you to download 3.6 seconds to download a 2-hour long 3D movie. Now, that means your consumption of this type of high quality, rich video will go up astronomically. And it's only probably a good thing for the likes of Netflix and Amazon Prime, because you will just get much more consumption at much faster speeds. But I wanted to talk to you about the controversy around 5G. As we know, we are all living through pandemic times. If anybody were to ask you what your 2020 were to look like last year, you probably wouldn't say like this. However, there has been a lot of scaremongering and rumors around 5G connected to coronavirus, believe it or not. So one of the things that we've seen in the UK specifically, which is quite sad, is a large amount of arson attacks on what were 4G or 5G masts. Now, this is not only quite sad, but it also really relays our historical mistakes. So back in the day, you saw these types of attacks, whether it was arson or dumping cement in a mast, happen for 1G, 2G, 3G. And a lot of it is around people's misconceptions around the wavelengths that are being omitted from these masts. Now, we are all around, and we can see that the NHS, for example, in the UK is very much in a tight spot where we're all helping, clapping, donating in order to make sure that our health service is able to address the corona situation. What's happened in the likes of Birmingham in the NHS Nightingale Hospital is somebody actually went in and destroyed the mast, which meant that there was no more connectivity for the hospital, as well as loved ones being able to contact patients in hospital. So it's important that, we have to, as senior executives, raise awareness around the fact that these types of attacks should not be tolerated. There is a lot of work from a regulatory perspective that's trying to combat that via Ofcom, but the controversy is largely something that will always be around, but it's important that we have those messages clear in our minds that the evolution of 5G is definitely something good, and what we might have thought was unreasonable at the 1G stage is now something that we could probably not live without. So that's probably the saddest part of the controversy that's been going on, but it's also related to masts themselves. So there was a lot of backlash around these large unsightly masts. That backlash has perhaps diminished, but it's still there. And it's a question of really working with local communities in order to find out the right solutions and positioning. But it's definitely something that can be negotiated in my view. Again, this is nothing new, and it's happened from the very beginning of the times of AM, FM radio. The other misconception and controversy is really around mass unemployment. So 5G, for many believe that 5G will leave them in a jobless situation, and that for one may be true, but the other flip side to it is also that we are looking and estimating a total of 22 million jobs created globally because of 5G by 2035. That means, the beauty of reskilling, upskilling, and looking at different avenues and pursuits and technology for those that want to pursue the realm as a career. There will be a lot of opportunity for the youth that graduate now and in future. So essentially, that for us is something that we're going to be looking forward to, not only from a manufacturer side, but also from an upskilling side as well as education side. The next is around cybersecurity. The controversy around cybersecurity is normally government to government, and it's mainly because a lot of the silicone that is created for 5G has been created in China and Taiwan. a lot of it means that there needs to be a regulatory body that looks at the infrastructure and how it's implemented and the data sharing that happens in the background. Now, Ofcom is doing that to a certain extent, but we are getting smarter, faster, savvier when it comes to looking at those attacks, diagnosing them, and being able to defend to cyber attacks. However, there is much more happening behind the scenes in relation, and there's much more talent going into cybersecurity that's allowing us to make headways in cybersecurity issues, and we know a lot more than we once did. So all of that will hopefully be a way for us to feel more secure whilst using these new networks, but also to make sure that we are proactive in the regulation of these networks and understand the legislation that is set to come out with the implementation of 5G. Now, what to expect from 5G? Well, this is probably one of my favorite topics because it's a certain sense of optimism that I think that we all need right now. And the first piece of optimism is that 72% of businesses need help imagining the possibilities in the future uses of 5G, and I guess that's where we come in. It allows business leaders in themselves to just look and have a good understanding of their own expectations. And all of the expectations, even though you can't imagine what's ahead, the expectations themselves are extremely bullish. So 90% plus are looking for new products and services and expecting them to be developed and invented over time. We're expecting 87% of new industries to emerge. Again, that goes in line with the mass employment that we're expecting from 5G. And also just to look at 5G in terms of company competitiveness and being at the edge and cutting edge, 5G is going to be a great enabler of that. And then looking at the actual increase of productivity, reskilling, upskilling the workforce, 89% of respondents in this research paper said that we were meant to expect an increase in that productivity. So all in all, thumbs up across the board. Now, when we look at 5G in action, here is where we become in a game-changing mode. Now, manufacturing. So what was a situation of labor-intense work where factories were creating anything from widgets to cars, you would find that the amount of staff that it took to get from A to Z and the creation and construction was a certain number. But then there is a background element that perhaps 5G is really going to be at the forefront of, and that's really safety. And something that I was reading about recently was really that car manufacturers themselves are looking, Rolls-Royce, for example, are building in specific computers that will be 5G enabled within their jet engines and cars to see and diagnose problems before they actually start. And a lot of this is powered by robotics, but it means that from the beginning of the process to the end of the process, there is a massive amount of health and safety that gets put in at the very beginning and then tested concurrently via robots and other styles of supply chain enhancement. So you are in a scenario where you are getting the absolute cutting edge as a user, whether you are going on and boarding a plane or driving a car, able to detect these issues with engines and other elements much more quickly. And that data then gets all stored and then sent back. So then when the R&D process starts again or continues, you're able to take that data and then reposition it to make better decisions on the next builds of engines. So for me, that is an entire game changer in the way that we look at the world. But 5G enables that because it allows you as a user to be able to understand what is actually happening on a day-to-day basis with your vehicle and how you then better assess treatment and how you actually save money from the treatment. Because sometimes if you've ever had a car break down and you're in a tight spot yourself, you will have to get a third party to go in. And whether or not you trust that third party is a question mark. With these types of diagnostic tools, you can go in and really understand what's wrong with the car before somebody actually comes in and services it. So much more transparency and much more user enablement, as well as empowerment that comes from the manufacturing side that flows into the consumer side as a result. So manufacturing is, I'm super excited to see what happens specifically in auto manufacturers, but it applies across the board. Transport. So you've probably heard in the UK this implementation of smart cities. We've been working with certain local authorities and looking at actually how do you implement a smart city? So how do you avoid road traffic accidents? How do you understand how to get into the best flow of traffic when you're trying to avoid large delays? Well, the smart city thought process is really behind a lot of that. However, a lot of local authorities have been slow to adopt the smart city concept just because of timing and spend, but it's something that will allow your journeys to be much more smooth, that will allow health and safety to be paramount, and again, to allow cities to actually collect this data in order to perhaps change the layout of infrastructure and make sure that you are absolutely the safest possible, enabled by 5G. So that's something I'm very excited about. And the next is really healthcare. So I was lucky enough to be able to speak to a cardiologist around this. And one of the things that you may or may not know, that if you have had any type of heart condition, you are in a scenario where there is an ability to have a three matchstick sensor implant. And what that does is it connects to the internet, and then it tells you, or tells the cardiologist team, when your heart is perhaps in an abnormal function or perhaps not beating in the right way. And these signals then get sent to a team of expert cardiologists who then look at what's going on and then diagnose on the fly. Now, how much time as a vulnerable individual does that save you? It saves you going into the doctors every so often. It saves you having very intrusive and long-term checkups that perhaps are inconclusive in certain circumstances. It saves you the time and gives you, most importantly, peace of mind, which having a small sensor, I think, would be a fantastic trade-off for an individual suffering from heart issues, as opposed to having to go back and forth into the hospitals, especially if the hospitals are tackling other issues such as a pandemic. So 5G enables sensors and scanners, whether that's for heart issues or other styles of medical problems, really change the game in the way that doctors interact with patients, as well as in the way that we are suddenly looking for diagnostic tools. So I am super, super bullish about that. And a lot of these sensors have already been implemented and seem to work quite well. Battery lives are around 3 years as well, which means that you don't have to go in and often change them either. But that is, in healthcare, from the cardiologist discussion that I had, seemed to be one of the most standout points that I wanted to share with you today. And this is ironic, because I guess as the shops open in the UK, they have been open for a while in France already. The idea of virtual reality, augmented reality, and 5G, and what that means to you. Well, if you're a shopper and you are craving to go into the likes of Fnac or Harrods or otherwise, you probably want to save time within that journey, or maybe you don't. Maybe you want to spend your whole day in there. But knowing what we know around 2-meter distancing, having an experience in the comfort of your own home or in a studio to try on clothes, makeup, etc., is something that seems to be the way that retailers are starting to transform themselves, which means that if you are short on time, but yet still have a couple of pounds and euros to spend on something new, you can treat yourself in the comfort of your own home and actually perhaps get secondary opinion by a style expert or anybody else that perhaps you value their opinion from. So this for me is super exciting because 5G will enable the speed and the activity of these types of experiences to increase, or the types of these experiences to increase in different ways that we haven't yet imagined. So mobility in itself, looking at how 5G will shape the future of enterprise mobility. So now from a corporate lens, we know the new work from home scenario. And I have to say in my career, I have tried to implement working from home for a little bit of time later on in my career. And, you know, a lot of that was taboo. You know, people would turn around and say, hey, you know, working from home means X, Y, or Z. And it was, a lot of it was based on trust. But in these types of COVID environments, there is no optionality. It's either you work from home or you don't work. And employees and companies cannot afford to be unproductive at this time. So what we experience today in terms of the cutouts in and out of Zoom calls, or perhaps very slow connections, depending on the quality of our Wi-Fi, this is going to be a massive game changer for employers, because it means that you and I can have these types of conversations on the fly, whether it's on a train, waiting in a business lounge, and you're not 100% solely dependent on a Wi-Fi connection that may or may not work for you, which means that you can be, you know, 10 times more productive on the fly. And that for me is definitely a plus sign, but you need to invest in this infrastructure in order to be able to get it done once and right and correctly. So smoother operations, I think a lot of IT thought leaders are looking at how that happens, deeper visibility, and more actionable outcomes. So for example, changing screen settings, enabling or disabling background noise depending on your environment. As well as cloud services. I don't know if you've ever tried, if you're especially on older IT networks, ever tried to send a very large file to somebody. And this file was usually quite critical. Employers are now looking at cloud services and storage, which has happened for a while, but to be able to download, send, share, enable, and work through those types of files is going to be a game changer, because it will be a matter of seconds as opposed to minutes, or retrying or cutting the file or zipping the file and spending a lot of time on things that perhaps aren't as productive as we need them to be. So cloud services, sending and sharing data from absolutely anywhere, will be a total game changer. And I've gone through augmented reality and virtual reality a little bit in our retail section, but these interactions will become much smoother, much more in tune, much more in depth, and much richer in terms of visuals. So let's look at it from a geographic perspective in terms of what's going on in the UK and in France. The first networks for 5G launched, EE and Vodafone, followed by O2. In terms of the regional reach, it hasn't yet quite penetrated the entire of the nation, but that's yet to come. And we are in a scenario where if 5G is to be implemented across the UK come 2021-22, you're going to see your Wi-Fi connection suddenly be very slow in relation to 5G connection, which will be an interesting conundrum to have, whether you stand outside your house and log in for that Zoom call, or whether you go in and use your Wi-Fi. That will be a choice, which I don't think wasn't really considered if you had a strong Wi-Fi connection in your house. In France, deployment slightly different. It's been discussed in 19, but now in 20 in February, the first phase of operators started to look at acquiring frequencies, and winners were SFR, Orange, etc. But now what we're seeing is that there's been a bit of a delay, and 5G in France was expected to happen in July of 2020. But because of COVID, we're now looking at perhaps several weeks or months. So let's call it up until 2021 until we see some real change in progress in 5G in France. But all in all, pretty much around the corner. So knowing that this is happening, there are a lot of barriers to adoption that seems to be sitting in either IT business leaders' way, as well as chief executives that are trying to reconfigure their business model in relation to the technology that's coming around the bend. The first and foremost is upfront investment. This stuff costs money, and you might be in a scenario where we do not have the luxury of spending enormous amount for IT and technology upgrades. Now, one of the things that we do very well at Econocom and that we've been working on in terms of 5G is actually looking at amortizing the cost over time and technology refreshes as a subscription. So instead of paying an upfront load that is cash dragging, that really leaves no space for other, perhaps more immediate actions to be taken, being able to amortize cost over time is really the game that we play in. And it's super interesting because it allows people to be more flexible, more creative, more inventive, and more cutting edge when it comes to adopting these new technologies. This is perhaps my day-to-day in a nutshell. The next is really around security. So looking at firewalls, looking at all the infrastructure that needs to be implemented as a result of 5G. And the loss is employee uptake, but I actually think that that perhaps will change quite drastically as we see 5G in action, because I think that when somebody actually realizes that they can have a phone call or conference call for more than 40 minutes and it not cutting out, or a Wi-Fi connection that perhaps is less than responsible or less than efficient, being replaced with a 5G network when you're running around to meetings, that I think will be a game changer in itself as we've seen the adoption from 1G to 5G. So employee uptake, I'm not sure how valid that is, but it is likely to be perhaps the first concern to be alleviated once everything is implemented. So how to get ready for 5G? Well, I've broken it down in 5 simple steps. And the first is define your 5G objectives as an organization. And in that, talk about your pain points. So where could you see more value in interactions? Where could you see video content being used more richly, more widely? And how do you then address that with 5G? The next is really around selecting technology providers. Now, we at Econocom are completely agnostic. We work with all of technology providers, and we're also not a bank, so we sit in between. So this is really important to make sure that you pick a technology provider that you understand and that understands you and your business objectives. Number 3 is once you've picked or done an RFP on certain technology providers, really looking at total cost of ownership and looking at different solutions in order to change the upfront payment costs that you may incur. And 4 is determine that funding strategy. So whether it's over time, in one go, looking at it from a refresh perspective, are all considerations that I would strongly advise you to do. And lastly, getting trained by a trusted tech supplier. Now with 5G and any type of technology, it's important that your aftercare is just as good as the time that you have those initial conversations, because it's in essence the aftercare that makes it all worthwhile and that allows you to really progress with your business goals and concentrate on what matters the most, which is driving growth. So in essence, I've talked a lot about 5G and only about 5G, but I hope that you learned something today that was new, anecdotally. So we've talked about the difference and what's so different in 5G versus 1G. I'm going to test you at the end virtually. No, I'm joking, but you will have an opportunity to look at lots of different examples if you'd like to, if we can share this presentation afterwards. The controversy we've talked about, and perhaps some of the controversy that we don't necessarily understand, or the controversy that needs to be highlighted and perhaps eradicated around arson attacks in the UK specifically. What to expect from 5G. We looked at 5G in action, so a couple of examples from manufacturing, from transport and logistics, as well as from medical and retail. 5G in action around the UK and France. Safe to say that we're looking at a 2020-2021 implementation timeframe across cities in both countries. And then barriers to adoption, so people's concerns and how perhaps to alleviate those concerns from an enterprise level as well as a personal level. And then lastly, how to get ready. So defining those objectives, understanding the total cost, and making sure that you've got a really great funding strategy to make these plans and strategies happen in good time. So that's it from me. I hope that you learned something. If there's any questions, I guess you can either put them in the chat or feel free to contact me offline. I'm happy to answer anything that I can. But I hope that your 5G journeys are incredible. And I hope that next time this year, we can talk about all of the benefits that we've been able to see and experience via 5G. Thank you so much, everyone.
Hi, thank you very much, Frances. We do have a few questions, so we have about 20 minutes to go over those. So let me start. As Frances mentioned, if you'd like to send more questions, please use the Q&A button and we'll be delighted to talk about them. So coronavirus, key topic at the moment. Do you think coronavirus is going to impact or is already impacting 5G implementation?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think actually from a consumer perspective, in terms of launching and then selling actively 5G enabled handsets, that might be delayed just because of logistic problems and supply chain issues that we're seeing, as well as just marketing, perhaps not being 100% focused on during Corona times. But I do believe that from an infrastructure perspective and from a local authority perspective, there's a lot more that's happening behind the scenes. People have been able to regroup and look at the options, as well as looking at and taking some more time, I guess, to look at total cost of funds. So it's twofold. I think for consumers, I think it might be a little bit more delayed than we expected. But when it comes to countrywide rollouts, then I think that that's actually going to be enhanced, because there's more requirement for it, knowing what we know now with Corona, and knowing that actually a lot of 5G can help us address the Corona and COVID-19 issues a bit more actively and a bit more proactively.
So on the same topic, you did mention that there are already some 5G networks in both France and the UK. But when can we expect it to become the norm, so the networks that is everywhere? And also, when are all these applications that you mentioned in manufacturing and all of that going to become reality? When are we actually going to see those?
It's a great question. So, I mean, to address the first question, the planning has happened, the masts are up. And the difference between a 5G mask and a 4G mask is it's basically the same technology, but upgraded in certain circumstances. So in many instances, you can repurpose the masks that are already out there. A lot of them have been repurposed, but then in terms of actually getting it into your hands, similar to the answer that I gave before, it's a question of having the enabled style technology in your hand. And that's going to take a long time, or longer than what we expect, to have them ready and have them actually at a price that's affordable for everyone. And I believe that's going to happen more 2021, 2022. When we look at augmented reality, when we look at virtual reality, there were some applications as well as headsets that have been rolled out already. But it's a question of adoption and barriers to adoption. So from a retail perspective, we're going to see a lot more retailers having to first get over the coronavirus and get their balance sheets back into action and get their profitability back into play if they didn't have a very strong e-commerce presence and had a very strong high street presence. And then that technology itself, I imagine that to be implemented on a day-to-day basis, probably more at the back end of 2021, 2022. But remember, these cycles are quite long because it takes a lot of time to bug, cost control, all of the cybersecurity and infrastructure implications that happen around the launches of these services won't be necessarily very easy, because we've had a delay Corona-wise. So for retailers to adopt and implement, I thought at the beginning, prior to Corona, that this would be more a 2021, early 2021 consideration. But now I'm thinking more that it's going to be more 2022, to be honest, just because of the fact that balance sheets have been hit so hard because of Corona.
Thank you. Sarah was saying that the presentation was great. Thank you, Sarah. Is asking, so you mentioned that 5G should create a lot of jobs. What type of jobs are we thinking about, and can you give us any examples?
Yeah, I mean, you have to think about it in both service as well as engineering, as well as all of the different data and analytics, science-driven, STEM-driven careers. So, my message to this is for you is the jobs that will be enabled will be more around the engineering side of the coin. However, there's going to be more maintenance that's required. There's going to be more service and after service care. I think that will come with 5G. So very much an open market that's yet to be explored and defined. But once the systems and the technology and scanners, et cetera, are ready for deployment and ready for consumption, there needs to be an afterthought around the maintenance that can happen in so many different ways, whether that's person to person, whether that's going in and actually maintaining new technology and looking at actually cyber attacks and risk around masks, et cetera. So the jobs are endless, and the types of jobs will be a moving feat. So I am actually interested to see, and I'm sure, Sarah, you may be as well, is to see the change that, for example, if you look for jobs on LinkedIn or Monster or any of those larger websites that that post jobs, I'm interested to see the thought leadership changes around what good looks like in technology in the next couple of years, because that is going to change drastically. I mean, it's really exciting.
We have two questions around data storage. So you did mention that obviously with 5G, we're going to produce a lot more data than we currently have, and we're going to need to store this data. But isn't data storage already a challenge? So how are we going to store all of this new data that we're creating? And how are we going to mitigate the impact on the environment? Because I think people are becoming more and more aware that data storage is very impactful on the environment.
I think the person that is able to solve for that problem is going to be the next Steve Jobs of technology. Because absolutely, is it a concern? Is data storage a concern? And all of the solutions that are being implemented at the moment, cloud, et cetera, we are going to be inundated with data from a consumable level, as well as from a day-to-day engagement and cybersecurity level. And that means that there is still much more to do in the future proofing or understanding data and how to best manage data, as well as implement safety around data sharing. And I know that some regulations have come through, over the years, GDPR being one of them, around cross-border data. But that is yet, in terms of job markets, that's another piece that I think is going to blow up, because nobody has really figured out the solution to long-term data storage issues. I mean, you have the likes of, Amazon, that won large-scale mandates from the Secret Service in the U.S., and a lot of companies that are re-engineering and I guess repositioning themselves in data awareness, cybersecurity, and data storage. But that is going to be a massive new market that will allow a lot of new entrants and disruptors to change the game there and think more strategically around how much data is going to be consumed and how much we need to store and how much we need to purge. So as simple, as easy as I want to say there's going to be a solution for it, I actually don't see that solution in the short term. But I can imagine that the likes of Google, Amazon, et cetera, are in the background, as well as disruptors looking to solve for those large scale problems.
Do you think this issue of storing data could prevent the more general implementation and rollout of 5G, or are you confident that the right solutions will be found in time?
I believe that the right solutions will be found in time. I mean, I'm not privy to a lot of those internal papers and white papers, but what I do know is that there is a lot of underlying regulation that's sitting around the 5G implementation that we perhaps don't see on a day-to-day basis. Perhaps it doesn't make headlines because we are all consumed, and we were all consumed with Brexit as well as now COVID-19. But what I can say in the background is that every single time a mask goes up, or every single time you get into a point where you're looking at suppliers for 5G, there is a lot of regulatory rigor that happens that needs to be that is just now the new norm, whereby everything is checked, rechecked over and over again in order to provide comfort before a government can actually go in and sign off to new implementation. So are we going to get to a point where hackers and cyber frauds are going to be are ever going to go away and disappear? No, because we get smarter, faster, stronger. But and certain people will always find ways to go through and I guess break the system. However, I think that being proactive and the proactive approach that we've taken on a local level, on a government level, has been much larger than what perhaps we see as consumers. And I think that that is an ever-growing it's an ever-growing field of work that is not going to stop anytime soon, and is going to be more proactive than what we see in the daily press today.
Thank you. One more question. So from a user standpoint, are we going to have to change our current devices to adapt to 5G? So computers, phones, and are we really going to need all these connected objects as well, the blender and all of those?
So, you know what the blender is? The blender is actually a good way to, it's kind of like a dual way to control what you eat, but also to look at things like, you know, reducing the type 2 diabetes and looking at your diet in a more measurable, standard way if you are, you know, unsure about nutrition intake. But I mean, the blender is another piece. Will we be adopting all of this? And my answer to that is yes, resounding yes. You're going to have to upgrade a lot of what you already have in your home. And if you don't know me personally, but what I can tell you is that I was absolutely reticent, even when I got to a point where, you know, Apple kept coming out with a brand new phone. I thought, oh, I'll keep my Apple 7 and then just wait until it goes through. And the minute that I got an iPhone 11, and plus I thought, wow, this is a complete game changer. And I bite myself because I thought, well, why didn't I just go for it in the first instance? Was money? Was it inertia? What were the reasons why I didn't want to go quickly? And those reasons, I'm sure, are going to happen in everybody's minds in terms of, do I invest in something, a new handset? But yeah, you're going to need something that's new because it's going to be dealing with much higher speeds. It's kind of like trying to get yourself from A to Z in a bicycle versus a car. You know, at the end of the day, you probably will upgrade to bicycle when it's a further journey. So it depends on how you consume data, I guess, is the first piece. Like if you're one of those people that still sends texts and just checks an address every so often on Google Maps when you're wandering around your location, then perhaps you don't need a 5G enabled phone. But if you're somebody like me that I've become, whereby you're watching a YouTube, or you're watching, for example, your company results or half yearly results, which I'll normally do on the overground or on a train, then a 5G enabled device is probably the way to go. You have to assess your needs. But then when you look at household appliances and other pieces, it's important to budget correctly and see what's really important to you. But I can tell you that some of these pieces, without you even knowing, are absolute game changers in terms of improving your quality of life, your productivity. And that's really up to you to assess which ones to adopt and which ones not to adopt. But I myself was an early adopter of a Fitbit because I like fitness and health. And I like monitoring, you know, my steps on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things that the Fitbit allowed me to do is just create that amount of awareness. And then when it came to upgrading it over time, you know, I did that quite actively. And because I wanted to be a part of that movement. So a lot of it is around these sub-communities that you'll find that people will adopt certain apparatus that makes sense, and it won't all happen at once, but you'll make a quick reconciliation between now and 5 years time. And you'll see, actually, look at the different types of technology I'm now consuming more and more of, just like, you know, the difference between 1 and 5G. So wait for it. And, you know, what my suggestion is if you want to be a part of the movement, you know, it's time to save, and it's time to make sure that you're budgeting accordingly. And at an enterprise level, even more importantly, that you can avoid upfront costs. If you can avoid upfront costs when you can, then try to, because a technology refresh option or subscription option is really the way to go in these days.
Thank you. Hearing you speak about how 5G is going to make everything so connected around us, there is often this debate that's coming back about whether internet and Wi-Fi should become almost like a right, like something that's available for everybody that we don't pay for anymore. Do you think 5G we're going to move towards that?
It's an interesting one. You know what my view is the telecommunication companies. I'll give you an example. When I was in my teens, I ended up, you know, being quite ridiculous and deciding that it was a good idea to make a long distance phone call to a friend of mine in France. I was living in the US. And I made the phone call, and lo and behold, I get a very angry father and mother sitting me down telling me that, one phone call cost them $100. Now that we know that a lot of the enablement, for example, WhatsApp, and we've got a lot of these different apps that allow you to make long distance calls, Skype, etc., MS Teams, to make long distance calls, Zoom, free, that democratization that I talked about at the beginning, I think is going to continue with certain apps. And suddenly certain things that we should not be paying for, such as roaming charges or long distance phone calls, will become obsolete. We've seen that happen. But I can tell you now that if you are in a telecommunications company, your main driver is growth, and you need to monetize every single thing that you do. So if you look at a balance sheet and you think, well, certain parts I can give for free, and other parts I can get subsidized via government, and other parts I can charge a consumer, that holy trinity of profitability is not going to go away. As much as we want Wi-Fi to be free for every single person, if somebody can get away with charging you in an airport lounge £10 for an hour, they will continue to do it. If the government suddenly puts an absolute stop to that activity, then that's a game changer. But those companies will have to find other ways of generating profit. And in this environment that we're in at the moment in COVID, I tell you, that's going to be something that's good and far between. I've seen some projects, just to go a little bit further, I've seen some projects in terms of Virgin in Africa going in and looking at creating mobile infrastructure and technology via balloon technology. And when I saw that, I thought, hey, that is democratization. But that was more, done on funding and local initiatives. If we have that kind of community spirit going forward, there will be a way for us to be able to change the dynamics of what we pay for and what we don't pay for. But that's not going to happen overnight, is my answer to you.
Thank you. And we have one last question to finish. So you mentioned that Econocom can provide finance to cover 5G needs and implementation. How does that differ from a bank loan?
Great question. Oh, I love that question. Okay. So here's the difference, right? There's been a lot of banking, of bank loans issued now and supported by the government. So they're called C-bills. And those C-bills don't have a fixed rate connected to them. The C-bills are based on Bank of England rate at 10 basis points and can be much more than that or around that price. But think about it. When it comes to going to a bank, they're not going to provide you and lend you money for free. There's always going to be a margin implemented in that. The way that we differ in terms of Econocom is that we see the wider view of all the different banks, and we're able to look at pieces and actually invest and put our skin in the game in order for you to get the right return on your investment, or in order for us to get the right return on our investment, for you to get the right return on your technology spend. So what does that mean in practice? It means that if you go to a bank, you're going to get an arbitrary amount, and that depends on lots of different factors. It depends on how long you've been at the bank for. It depends on what your credit repayment profiles look like. It depends on how much you've been using of other different types of products and service. It depends on if you're a value client. It sometimes depends, unfortunately, on who you know and how quickly you can navigate. So those are the 5 dependencies that you're looking at when you're going to a bank. If you already have a credit line in a bank, to pursue that option is absolutely common sense. But what you're not seeing is the rest of the market. You kind of have to look at it from a money supermarket perspective, whereby you would now in no way, shape, or form just go to one insurance provider to get your health insurance. You wouldn't. You'd look and you'd shop around. What Econocom enables you to do is to do the absolute same thing, but look at it from a finance and technology perspective, because we are experts in our field. We've been doing this since 1974 on everything: hardware, software, CCTV cameras, 5G mass. Like, implementation is not our bag, but to be able to look at technology for technology's sake and be able to do that kind of supermarket approach to financing is what we do absolutely best. And whether we do that ourselves within our own financing arm, or whether we do that with a trusted bank, we will obviously give you the absolute best, and not ask you 2 seconds later why you haven't transacted a foreign exchange with us in the past 12 months. So it's a singular relationship that gives you the best of breed in terms of rates and pricing.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a great place to stop. So it's time for me to thank you, Frances, for your presentation. I thought it was very insightful. Thank you also for all your answers to your question. Thank you to all the participants for joining us today. We will share Frances' presentation and a recording of the whole session if that's something you'd like to share with your colleagues.
Sure.
As always, when you leave, you will receive the link to a survey. Please take a minute to tell us what you thought about this morning's webinar and what you'd like to see from us in the next few months. And that's us from us. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye now.
Bye.